This is Exopolitics Radio. I'm Alfred Lambermont Weber, and we're with a very special guest, Stanley A. Fulham, who is a former NORAD officer and the author of an extraordinary book, which I recommend to all of you as a remarkable revelation of exopolitics, politics, government, and law in the universe, and how matters really function around our planet Earth. Welcome, Stan.
Yes, thank you, Alfred.
For those of our listeners who may not be familiar, I wondered if you could just briefly introduce yourself and say how it was that you were first introduced to interaction with other intelligent civilizations.
Yes, well, first of all, I served during World War II in Bomber Command, and I was shot down in 1943, and I ended up in a prison camp. One of the prison camps I was in was Stanley 357 near Torun in Poland. And on a hot summer day in July 1944, somebody ran in and said, "There's a rocket in the sky above." And we all ran out. We looked, and there it was, this huge red rocket. It had no wings, and it made no sound, but it was traveling at considerable speed. And so, of course, we assumed it to be a German rocket because the Germans had the V-1 and the V-2 rockets, which they were hurling at England at that time. Until somebody confounded the issue when he said, yes, but it's flying from east to west, and we are in Poland. So obviously it's coming from Russia, and Russia had no such technology. We all trained in aircraft recognition, so we knew what all the military aircraft in the world looked like. This was no conventional military aircraft. But never for one moment did we ever think that this would be an alien spacecraft, because during the war, that was not a conventional concept. Nobody thought of aliens. And so we forgot about it. And also in our camp, I had several fighter pilots who were shot down, and were telling me about their experience with Foo Fighters. You're aware of Foo Fighters, Alfred, I'm sure?
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm sure many of your listeners are as well. Well, Ron, my good friend, was telling me about his experience with these Foo Fighters when he was flying on a sortie over France, and two of these Foo Fighters attached themselves to each wingtip and flew alongside of him for about 10 minutes. He was rather frightened about the incident because he really had never seen anything like this before, but they didn't take any action against the Spitfires, so he relaxed, and in about 10 minutes' time, they flew away. He returned to base and reported the incident to the debriefing officer, but he was met with absolute cynicism and a bit of ridicule. And so he was telling me, he says, I had the same experience on two other occasions, but I never again reported these incidents. And I thought, yeah, that's pretty well typical. People just don't want to be ridiculed and laughed at on these matters. So, but still, they were not alien spacecraft. No one ever thought of that during the war. It was only when, you remember the Don's experience when he spotted the flying saucer over Oregon in 1947?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
And only at that time when he reported that, and there was a book written about it, then, and of course the Roswell incident, then of course the military and the world then realized, then what we were witnessing were alien spacecraft of some type or another. So I left the Air Force, and I did a number of things, went to university and all this sort of thing, but I returned to the permanent force several years later. When I returned, I worked as a fighter controller in NORAD. A fighter controller is one that controls the fighter jets onto the enemy bombers, so to speak, because it's all done at night, and of course they don't know where they are. They can't see them. So you're going to bring the fighter to within about 30 to 40 miles of the enemy bombers, and then their own radar takes over, and they come in for the attack. Fighter controllers do that, and besides that, we we monitor all of our skies. It's a continental defense. NORAD is just that. I want to explain too that NORAD is not a military organization. NORAD is a defense system. I was a member. I was an officer in the Canadian Air Force, and my good friend, the intelligence officer I dealt with in NORAD, was a USAF officer. But anyway, is that was part of our work, identifying all the aircraft flying all over North America. One particular incident when I reported for duty one midnight shift is that there were two UFOs that were hovering over about 2 miles away from the base, and they just at about 1,000 feet. They just sat there for quite a while with their lights around the perimeter of the air spacecraft. Nothing else was happening, and so I checked with NORAD on the matter and reported the incident. And then I scrambled two standby jets after them. When they took off, then the UFOs flew away and hovered over the Pacific Ocean several miles west of Vancouver. And minutes later, when our jets approached them, then they sped away over the Pacific Ocean, and we never saw them again. But the next morning, the base commander called, and he says, the media are calling. And as you know, there was nothing unusual that happened last night. There was no reason for us to be speaking to the media. And that was fine. We understood that we weren't going to contravene the base commander's the orders on this matter. But about 2-3 weeks later, NORAD called for a meeting with the squadron commander, myself, and the technical officer. And what they wanted to do is they were not critical of what I had done, but they wanted to refine the reporting process. And so we discussed this at length all day. And that night I sat down at the bar with one of these intelligence officer, I call him Major Dave. And I told him about the incident with the base commander telling us, well, you don't talk to the media. He says, yes, there's an international agreement that was signed, I think it was 1956. He saw the papers. And he says, there were no signatures to them, so I don't know who signed them. But he says it was an agreement between Canada and the United States whereby it would regulate and control the dissemination of information on UFOs. And he says that's all part of the process. And that remained pretty well the system all the way through. And then I'd like to mention one more thing, Alfred. It was also a mindset, a military mindset. Years later, Dave, my good friend, the NORAD intelligence officer, was telling me, he says they were at the NORAD officers' mess dinner. And the general there was telling them about his experience when he appeared before a congressional subcommittee hearing on continental defense. And he said that included, of course, NORAD. And he said they humiliated me. They ridiculed me. He says they insulted me. He says they implied as that NORAD officers were suffering from illusions and delusions. So one of the officers standing by said to him, but General, if the public were made more aware of the situation, then the politicians then would be more likely to come out and speak on this issue. And the general said, the public is uneducated, it's uninformed, misinformed, and they're just too effing stupid to cope with the reality of an alien existence. And then he turned to my friend Dave and he said, Dave, I tell you, if you want a career in this Air Force, you keep your mouth shut about UFOs. And Dave, he accepted that mindset. That was it. And it was mine as well. You don't talk to the public about it because all you get is ridicule. And then throughout my career, I never discussed it. Dave did the same. But I've just given you this bit of background to understand why I waited so long to do any writing about it.
Sure. Now, just to begin to ease into the in-depth story here, you've actually been in I just want to use the term dimensional communication because you use a dimensional go-between to communicate with a group of representatives of a group of interdimensional beings who in turn have related to you the activities of what I would call a regional galactic governance body called the Council of Eight. Is that sort of a fair
Yes.
A fair characterization?
Yes.
Now, how was it that you came about to be in this set of circumstances, just from the human point of view?
Well, Alfred, I left the Air Force. I retired from the Air Force, and so did my friend Dave. He was in the intelligence work there. And when we retired, we were left with the same questions we had when we joined the Air Force. Who were they? Where were they from? Are they a threat? What about the abductions? All of these questions we had, and we had no answer, but it bothered me, and I really wanted to know. So I never talked to the agents, so I had no contact with them. I read every book on UFOs that I think was ever published. There were no answers. There was this sighting and there was that sighting, but there's nobody could come out right and tell us, well, this is where they're from, this is what they're doing here, and this type of thing. So it was a very frustrating time for me. So I was talking to a very spiritual friend of mine, and I said to her, one of the things that really confused me, and not only me, all the officers in NORAD and the fighter pilots as well, who had experience with UFOs, is that, like on my radar, sometimes you were tracking a UFO, it would appear, disappear, suddenly. And also I talked to a fighter pilot who was chasing a UFO over the mountains in British Columbia there, and he said the UFO disappeared into the side of a mountain at terrific speed, probably well over 2,000 miles an hour. There was no crash, no explosion. And then he says, a moment later, it appeared to the top of the mountain, hovered for a moment, and then flew away, completely unscathed. I talked to a commercial airlines pilot who was flying from Europe to the United States, and he told me of a similar incident where he saw this UFO dive into the sea, no crash, nothing else, and a few miles further, it reappeared, hovered around his aircraft for a while, then flew away. And that is what I found very intriguing, because that obviously was in total violation of all our third-dimensional physical laws. So obviously they were not from our dimension. So I explained this to my spiritual friend, and I said, there's no way of me getting this information because I can't contact them, I can't talk to them. How will we ever find out about this, this reality? And she says, well, you can. She says, you can go to the spiritual world. The spiritual world knows all of these things because they have their Akashic records. They can see. And the other thing is, at the subconscious level, the soul is non-separate from all other souls in the universe. Now, that's a concept which is very difficult for anybody to understand or to accept. In fact, it's beyond our comprehension. I'm not going to belabor that, but I'm telling you what information I got. And so she suggested to me that I can talk to a group known as the Transgender Group, which is a group of 43,000 very old souls who have lived on different planets, lived in the spiritual systems here, realms here and there, have a vast wealth of experience and knowledge, and they've grouped together to provide advice and assistance for those of us who are on that rugged trail back to the Creator. It's not an easy ride. It's a pretty rough life, as many of your listeners, I'm sure, would agree. So, she said, you can contact them through a channeler. And she recommended that I do so through Rick Thurston, who is a very reputable person here in Canada. Well, I was born and raised in the Catholic Church, and I attended the Catholic University and this sort of thing, so that sort of went against my background quite a bit, but I was so desperate for information that I finally contacted Rick, and I talked to the transgenders for the first time for about half an hour, and I tell you, I was in a complete state of shock, because I realized there was nothing about me, about my past, that they didn't know, and even some of the things about my future. And so I sort of sat back for a while, but a few months later I went back, and then I carried on a dialogue with them for about the past 11, 12 years, talking to them almost regularly every month, one thing or another. And I found out it doesn't matter. Whatever question I have for them, I can ask them about the string theory. I can ask them about some of